Hey, it's Ben here. Today I'm going to show you how to make a custom modal component in React Native that'll bring up a little window or dialog over top of your current screen. You might have used the inbuilt modal before or one of the community made ones, and while these are really great, you might be like me and your app or your game has a lot of modals in it, and it gets pretty tedious rendering these, configuring them, writing them in all of your child components. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a modal that we can render once near the top of our app. We don't have to redefine it in all of our children. We can just make some function calls to interchange the contents of the modal, which saves you a lot of time. I'm going to walk you through that step by step. The code's going to be in the description, so let's get started. So we have a very simple app here. We just have a container view with a couple of elements in it. You can see here it's just a button that says show modal, and we have the actual modal component rendered here. So this won't show anything by default. We're just putting it in a place where it'll be able to show over top of everything else. So you don't want to put this inside a bunch of child elements. You want to put it as high up in your app as you can. And I'll explain how we actually use that and make calls to it. If we have a look over at our modal component, this is just the bare bones what we're going to work off. I have written all the modal stuff ahead of time, so you don't have to watch me type it all out. I'm just going to drop in bits and pieces as we go along. I've written this as a class component as opposed to a function component because I want to have a bunch of methods that we can run on the modal, like show. Later we're going to register children with it as we go along. But for now, this is kind of the clearer way. You can kind of use a function component and use React's forward ref to allow you to call functions on a ref to a function component, but I use that sometimes, but I think for this example, it's a bit clearer if we just have a class. So we have no props at the moment. We'll get to that later, but we have a state. The state's very simple at the moment. It's just visible. So are we showing the modal or not? And a child, which is just the modal contents of what we want to show inside it. In the render method where we actually show what this component is going to look like, we just have if it's not visible, return nothing. If it is visible, then we want to show a backdrop, which is just a full screen black with transparency display, just to cover your current screen contents. And on top of that, we just have this invisible container, which is also full screen, and it'll just center your actual modal contents inside it. So inside there, we actually drop the child in. As for the styles that you can see here, these are what we're going to animate later when we're actually showing and hiding the modal. So you can see here we have the scale. So I'm going to do like a grow, so it's going to start as a little point, and the modal contents are going to grow out into the full box. Opacity is just one. I'm probably not actually going to change this later on. We could fade it in, but for simplicity, we won't do that now. As for the actual backdrop, we are going to animate the opacity for that. So we're going to fade it in from nothing to slightly opaque black background. As for the constructor, we're basically going to treat this as like a singleton class. So we're only ever going to have one instance of this modal. We're not going to reuse it throughout the app. We have this static class variable called instance. So this is going to hold the instance to the one modal that we've rendered at the root of our app here. And you're just going to be able to access this by going, like we've done in here, modal.instance. So that will get you essentially a reference to this modal that we've got, and there's only one. So basically a singleton. How we do that is when we call the constructor on it, we set that modal instance to the current instantiated class. So this constructor is only ever going to run once for this one modal that we render. So that means from anywhere in our app, we're going to be able to go modal.instance and get that reference easily. And in there, we're just initializing the state. By default, not visible. By default, we're going to have this little sample modal contents as the child. Later, we're going to set the child dynamically, but for now, I've just hard-coded in a view. So I'll show you what this looks like when we pull it up. So if we hit this button in the middle, show modal, you can see it's just flashed onto the screen, no animation or anything. And we just have this little modal view here. So I'll give you a look at the code for that. It's nothing fancy. It's just this sample view, literally just a container with a styled box and some text in the middle. So yeah, nothing interesting going on there. But you can see if I tap around, we can't close the modal. So we don't have any facility for that yet. So what we're going to want to do next is animate the backdrop. So we've got a backdrop opacity here, just an animated value. And we're going to scale the modal contents. For this, we're just going to do a sneaky and we're just going to interpolate the opacity. So because they're going to be animating at the same time, we don't really need to have an extra animated value from it. We can just sort of chain the scale off that opacity. So if you have a look down in the constructor, Here we're actually instantiating that backdrop opacity as an animated value to begin with. And then the interpolation here, you can see we're taking that animated value, and what we're doing is we're mapping it from its range. The range of the backdrop opacity is from 0 to this default opacity I've set, 0.6 at the moment. And we're gonna take that range and map it onto the range 0 to 1 because we wanna scale our content from nothing to full scale, which is 1. So that's just gonna move as the backdrop opacity moves, and that means when we do our animation, we only need to animate one of the animated values, which is quite convenient. Added a few more methods in here. We want to be able to hide and show our modal and animate it when we do so. So this toggle visible, this is basically one method which covers both hiding and showing the modal. Because there's a lot of overlap between them, you can kind of combine them into one toggle function. Do show indicates that we want to show the modal when we're toggling it. So if that's false, we want to hide it. So to begin with, if do show, we're going to set the modal to visible. This is just a private method I've made in the modal with the hash, means it's private. And this is just doing a change of state. It's just convenient to wrap that in a method because setting the state can be a little verbose sometimes. We set that to true if we want to show it. And then we're just going to set up this animation we've got. So we're using an animated timing, which is just simple animation. So we're going to take it to a certain value. If we want to show it, we're taking it to the full backdrop opacity because that's the value that we're animating, is that backdrop opacity. So if we want to show it, we take it to the full opacity. If not, we take it to 0. I'm going to hide it. Duration of 200 milliseconds, it just looks good. And for the easing, it's not really important, but I found it just looks better when you've got a sort of interpolating that animation more on the out part of it when you're showing the modal and more on the in when you're hiding it. For the timing itself, we're going to use the native driver just for the smooth animations, and we're going to plonk in those values we define. Then we have a little callback here. So we start the animation, and this little callback we add in there is going to run when the animation finishes. All this is doing is if we are hiding the animation, so if we called this toggle with do show false, then we want to set visible to false once the animation finishes. Yeah, so this toggle visible, this is handling the animation. And just for convenience, we are wrapping this private function into two simple public methods that we can call from our instance. So we've got show, which should be true, that's silly, and hide. So we're just calling that private toggle function in the right way based on show or hide. So that's just exposing a nice interface to the outside. And to get those animations actually happening, what we're going to do is chuck in that animated value from the state into our backdrop opacity. And for the scale, we're just going to take that interpolated animation and chuck it in the scale transform of our container. We said we wanted to be able to hide the modal, makes sense. What we're going to do is just look for touches on the backdrop and then hide it if we receive one. So basically when you release your finger on touch end, we're going to get this modal hiding. So let's have a look at how this turned out in the actual app. So we're going to click on show modal, pulls it up. We're going to click on the backdrop and yep, shrinks back down. So we've got some nice growing and backdrop opacity fading going on there. So that's a good start. One thing I might also mention is when you're writing it in a class component like this, if you're using Expo like me, it's not going to work with its fast refresh. So whenever you make changes to this modal class, you're going to want to do a full refresh, just as a note. So the next thing we're going to want to do is be able to change the contents of the modal. So we're going to do this by registering and unregistering children. And with the game I'm making, I have a lot of different modals that I'm pulling up, so I'm going to be wanting to switch the contents of that all the time. I'll show you how we're going to do that. You can see in the constructor, now we're just setting the child as default to nothing. So now it's going to be all based on the registration. Have a look down here, I've added some methods. So we've got register child. So it takes in a React node and this unregister on close, which basically is going to give you the option to automatically unregister the child component when you close the modal. So if you are kind of in a smaller case and you have less modal contents and you don't want to be unregistering that all the time, you can just keep it up. So when you call show again, it's going to pull up that same modal contents. But by default, I'm going to have it so it unregisters. So you need to set the child contents whenever you want to show that modal. What this is doing is just setting that child to the React node that you're passing in and just setting that unregister on close, which I've added to the state. So by default, that's true. So whenever we close it, unregister. And again, this unregister method, very simple. It's just setting the state to empty child and the default of unregistering on close. And where this happens is when the animation finishes. So the callback in the animation start method. If we're showing the modal, don't do any of this. But if we are hiding the modal, then we want to run these lines. So again, we're setting visible to false, and then if we're unregistering on close, then we just call unregister child. Very simple. So all of this is going to change the usage of the modal. So if we look back in the app, we've now got a little function that we call whenever we press the button. So what it's going to do is register that child, which is the sample view, and then we're going to show it. We could combine these into one function and just say when we call register child, just show the modal automatically, or we could add that as another parameter in it. But for now, I'm just going to register and then call. So let's see how that looks. Press the button, pulls out the modal. Press the backdrop, drops it. Rinse and repeat. That's all working good. So from here, another thing you're going to want to be able to do with your modal is a lot of the time it's useful to be able to trigger some certain effects when the modal falls down. As an example, in my game I have this modal you can pull up which is for a refinery building, which is processing ore into a special resource. And basically in this modal you can configure a bunch of stuff, like you can set crystals to change the efficiency of your resource production. And when you close this modal, you want to update the server with this new configuration that you've set. So that's one use case for this, but basically it's useful to be able to do something when you close the modal. So next we're going to add a callback for that. So what we've done here is we've added an extra property to the state, and we've got this onClose function that's expecting to have in there. In the constructor, we just set this to a do nothing function. And when we register our child, what we're going to accept is an onClose callback. So you can pass one in, or by default, it's just going to do nothing. So it stores that in the state. And again, that'll get unregistered when we close it. Where that gets used is when we're hiding the modal in this little callback in the animation. What we're going to do is just simply make a call to this.state.onClose. And that's going to run our function. We can have a look at how that plays out. We go back to our app. You can see when I register this child again, I'm going to pass in this function, the onClose modal, and that's just going to print some junk to the console. So pull up the app, and we're just going to tap show modal. And you can see as we hide it, yeah, nice, we get that little print. And we can do that as much as we want. It'll call it each time. You might have noticed I added a few extra things in the props of this modal. Basically, I'm letting you customize the backdrop opacity. Also, you can set the container style and the backdrop style to whatever color or size, whatever you want. So the backdrop style goes in here in the modal backdrop, and the container style is here in the container. And really for the container, that's just in case like maybe you don't want to center your components or your contents of the modal. You want to put them at the top or just some arbitrary flex arrangement. So you can do all that now. So that's really the majority of the modal there. I can show you a little bit of like messing around with these props. So I've just set the backdrop to green, for example. You do stuff like that. You can change the container style to position your modal contents nicely on the screen wherever you want. But yeah, that's really about it. It's mostly what I wanted to cover. So that's about it for the modal component. You can go and check out the code, it's in the description. You can check it out on Git. You might notice a few differences there, like I do some keyboard handling stuff, like if the keyboard's up and you press the backdrop, it'll dismiss the keyboard. If you like the vid, feel free to leave a like. If you want to follow my game, you can check me out on Twitter, @BenScottSteer, and also have a Discord channel going if you want to have a chat and join the community. So thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.